Hello, folks. I'm Tim Carter, the creator of the Blood and Leather podcast, and I want to welcome you to episode 6 of the podcast, Hunt's Expedition Crosses the Plains. As I've said in the past with other episodes, I'm here to try to share my love for my favorite times, people, events from the history of the U.S. with anybody who might be interested. And from my perspective, history is one long, unending story. And as the story unfolds, there are always more connections. So I look forward to making those connections in this episode. Now, I reiterate what I've said in the earlier episodes that, I thought I would start and quickly cover the fur trade in the U.S., or in North America at least. But it was naive. My thinking was very naive. So I've been working on examining and explaining what was going on with the fur trade and the evolution of the fur trade and the evolution of Canada and the United States as well for the last 4 episodes, and this will be the 5th. So 5 out of my 6 episodes will deal with this concept. This one's going to deal with Wilson Price Hunt and the partners that he brought on as they continued to travel up the Missouri River. I think in the last episode we covered the trip north, and we saw Hunt meet with Daniel Boone and John Coulter. We kind of wrapped up with the successful negotiation with the Teton Sioux, who wanted to stop Hunt and his expedition from making their way northward. Today we start with the journey resuming, and only a small portion of the journey is going to be by river. The overland portion is going to begin during this episode. So we're going to follow Hunt and his weary travelers as they begin to navigate the challenges of the Rocky Mountains, and not quite the Rockies yet, because we're going to navigate the prairie to get to the Rocky Mountains is probably the best way to say that. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Snake, the Blackfoot Indians. We're going to have a lot of challenges coming, and we're going to see some of those happening here in episode 6. Now, tellingly, we're not going to cross the Rocky Mountains yet. The Rocky Mountains are going to come up in episode 7, and we're going to see what takes place in Idaho and Oregon, which it's some very bleak times coming up there. But we got to get to the Rocky Mountains first, and this episode is all about that. Now, I'm going to use Washington Irving's wonderful book, Astoria, as the chief resource here, but I'm going to also use a lot of other information that I will pull from wherever I think appropriate, if I know about it. Now, obviously, I don't know everything, and I certainly don't know everything about the Pacific Fur Company and the American Fur Company, Wilson Price Hunt, and this expedition. I don't know everything, so I'm learning frequently as much as you are, probably more than you are, because I'm really having to dig in and trying to process this. So I hope you'll stick with me, and I look forward to this one. Let's get cranked up. On June 1st, 1811, the Pacific Fur Company, which is a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, the overland expedition of the Pacific Fur Company under the command of Wilson Price Hunt, arrived at the Great Bend, or the Great Detour, of the Missouri River in modern-day South Dakota. Now, this portion of the river turns north and then curves back around in a southeast direction before heading back northwest and following the original tendency of the river. On this departure from the norm, the river travels about 25 miles to arrive back at a location that is just 3/4 of a mile away from where it started by land. This peninsula that's made by the flowing river was a noted landmark by all the travelers on the river back in the early 1800s. Everybody knew the Grand Detour, or the Great Bend, and today it's part of Lake Sharp, created by the Lake Sharp Dam just south of the Great Bend. The morning after arriving at the Great Bend, the party saw 2 Indians standing on the riverbank, waving their buffalo robes and indicating that they were friendly. When they pulled the boats to the shore, they realized that these 2 men were part of the war party that had given Crooks and McClellan such a difficult time back in 1809. The 2 men were quite concerned that Crooks and McClellan might be harboring a grudge, as you might expect they would. But all proved to be copacetic, and after a peace pipe was smoked, everything kind of settled down. But there was still some reason to be concerned, because in the course of the conversation with the two warriors, they admitted that they had recently killed 3 white men. Now, they pointed to Alexander Carson, one of the men who had joined the party after they passed the Omaha village. One of the chiefs said that they had killed the white men because Carson had killed another warrior of their tribe. Carson admitted as much when he was confronted with the question. He had been on one bank of the river with a group of Arikara warriors when the Sioux war party appeared on the other side of the river. And Carson threw up his rifle, took a quick shot, not expecting to score a hit at such a great distance. But to his shock, the bullet struck and one of the Sioux warriors toppled over. Now for this, 3 white men had been killed. And by such thin threads did life hang on the prairie, where an eye for an eye was practiced just as diligently as if the war parties lived by the law of the Old Testament. And it seems that often the actions of the Indians were simply a retaliation for some sort of premeditation on the part of the whites. But the Indians were condemned without acknowledging the actions of the whites. After a little more conversation, the 2 warriors were given some presents, and they went on their way, so everything worked out okay. Things had gone well, and spirits were high. But, we've come to expect on this journey west that things don't go well for very long, and soon 2 other warriors rode up. It seems they had seen their 2 brethren, and they had been told of the group of white men on the river who were handing out gifts. Everybody likes Santa Claus. These warriors didn't think that the presents that had been handed out to their friends had been enough, and they had come back for their own. And here they were. Now, if you're of my generation, you may have heard folks talk negatively about young people who are feeling too entitled. They want something for nothing, wanting to start at the top. You get the picture. Now, it's clear that there have always been entitled people, and if there was one thing W.P. Hunt didn't like, it must have been Sioux, who felt entitled. He didn't like how they approached the boats, and he didn't like how they demanded more presents, and he told them so in no uncertain terms. And just like the declaration from the soup Nazi on Seinfeld, there would be no presents for these Indians. In fact, he let them know that if they or anybody else from their tribe came back asking for more presents, they'd be considered enemies of the expedition. Don't go away angry. Just go away. As you might expect, this infuriated the Sioux. They turned their horses and they galloped away at full speed. And it was at about this time that Hunt started thinking about what had just happened. Just where were those Indians headed? How many others were just over the hill or back in their village, still within striking distance? He better get the men together, keep them close to the boats, and be prepared for the attack that seemed inevitable. As part of this preparation, it was agreed that the largest boat, commanded by Hunt, would hug the northeast bank of the river as it headed upstream. The 3 remaining boats would stay on the south side so that at least one boat could see what was happening on the banks above the boat or boats on the other side of the river. That the embankments were high. They were often cliffs that were hanging over the river. So if you were on the side of the river under the cliff, you couldn't see up the embankment very far at all. So using this strategy of watching the other boats from across the river, they were going to head upstream. And then they were going to also sound the alarm if they heard or if they saw anything untoward about to happen to their friends on the other boats. 2 quick shots were the agreed upon signal, and thus prepared, the boats went up the river. Now, in the late afternoon, the boats encountered a sandbar, and that sandbar was big enough that it divided the river into 2 separate streams. While trying to navigate his side of the sandbar, Hunt realized that he's going to have to turn back and take a route on the other side of the obstacle. There's just no way to make it up on the side he had chosen. The order to turn the boat around had just been given when 2 shots rang out from across the river, and soon mounted warriors poured down the embankment and took their place along the river at the lower end of the sandbar. The warriors were an awesome spectacle. They were naked, or nearly so. They were painted with black and white stripes, carrying bows and arrows and battle clubs and rifles and buffalo hide shields. And Hunt and his men were trapped by this group of about 100 warriors. As happens in all the old westerns, the situation looked kind of bleak. The men on the other boats saw the predicament, and they rapidly made for Hunt and his boat. If the warriors chose to attack now, the other boats wouldn't really be able to make it in time to help very much. But they were on their way, and that's always some psychological benefit for the party needing rescue. It was at just this moment when things were really looking their worst, that the Indians did something unthinkable. They ran up the river until near the boats, and then they threw down their weapons and buffalo robes, waded and swam out to the boats, extended their hands to shake with the men on board. It turns out that these weren't the Sioux that Hunt had been expecting. Instead, they were a mixed party of about 300 Arikaras, Mandans, and Minotari warriors, and rather than being a threat, they were a war party in search of the very Sioux that Hunt himself thought he would have to fight. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now that the Indians and the white men had met, the war party was canceled. I think that's just funny. We're going to go on a war party. Wait a minute. We see some guys coming up the river with some boats to trade. Forget the war party. Just as you might expect might happen, the war party was canceled, and they made plans for everybody to go to the Arikara village and have a big party. Hunt and his expedition, they needed horses, and the Indians wanted to trade for weapons and ammunition so that they could teach those uppity Sioux a lesson once and for all. It was really a perfect opportunity to conduct some commerce. But first, the two groups had a feast, and the war party danced and sang long into the night, putting on a big demonstration for the white men. The next morning, the boats headed upstream to the village, while the mounted war party headed out overland directly to the village. It was a 3-day journey overland, and that would be a lot faster than the journey on the river, so off they went. But not so fast. Back came the chief, who wanted to have a parley. He explained to Hunt that he just couldn't go back to the village empty-handed. It's kind of a standard thing. His people wouldn't believe him if he didn't bring back something that would prove the white men were coming to trade. Now Hunt understood what was happening, and he gave the chief some powder, a bag of lead balls, and 3 dozen knives. The chief was satisfied, and it was just beginning to look like Hunt and his men could head upriver in peace when another Indian ran up the shore, announcing the arrival of another boat filled with more white men. Manuel Lisa had just arrived. In episode 5, which I highly recommend you go back and take a listen to, I recall saying that Hunt's attempt to outpace Lisa was foolhardy. Lisa was experienced on the river. He had already proven that he could travel faster than Hunt by making his trip from St. Louis, which started 4 weeks later, and still catching Hunt on the way up by the time they reached the Arikara village. Now, he was here. And what's Hunt going to do about that? Well, there wasn't much he could do. He stopped his boats and he waited for Lisa to catch up. You have to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. And Hunt knew he didn't hold the cards to win. Soon, Lisa came around the river bend and into sight, 20 men at the oars and pulling hard upstream. And it's here that I encourage you to cast your mind back to one Robert McClellan, the crook's partner who thought Manuel Lisa had encouraged the Sioux to stop their 1809 expedition to the Mandan villages. The same McClellan who had vowed to shoot Manuel Lisa if he saw him in Indian country. Well, this was Indian country, and there was Manuel Lisa. So McClellan started looking for his rifle, and he was barely restrained by Hunt, who managed to keep the lid from blowing off the entire situation. This must have been an interesting meeting. Lisa didn't trust Hunt. Hunt didn't trust Lisa. Crooks and McClellan didn't trust Lisa, nor he them. And here they all were, together. Hunt thought, and reasonably so, that Lisa would take full advantage of his boatmen to outpace the expedition, beating them to the Arikara village and poisoning the mood of the tribe towards him. They would have to watch Lisa closely to be sure he didn't slip away and head upstream. Now, for his part, McClellan swore that he would shoot Lisa if he tried anything underhanded. And again, here they were. Now, for 2 days, everything was good. Interactions between the parties were strained, but they were cordial. But the 3rd day brought the fireworks that we would have expected from the start. They'd been stuck in camp because of heavy rain, and let's be honest, a day in camp with the rain coming down, well, that'd make most of us even though we might be pretty even-tempered, a bit testy. Lisa decided that now was a great time for him to talk to Pierre Dorian, get him drunk, and if Dorian were drunk enough, well, he could be convinced to desert Hunt and resume his employment with the Missouri Fur Company. But sometimes, now, let me go back and just be sure I reiterate this, because some of you may not have listened to the last episode. Pierre Dorian was the interpreter and guide that Hunt had hired to make sure he could kind of get through the Sioux territory and overland. A well-regarded guide and especially an interpreter. He had worked for the Missouri Fur Company and Manuel Lisa, and so there was some bad blood there. But as I said, Lisa was wanting to get Dorian drunk and to convince him to come back to the Missouri Fur Company. But the best laid plans often go astray, and although he was drinking hard of his favorite whiskey, and although he was thoroughly drunk, Dorian wasn't interested in switching allegiances at this point. When this approach didn't work, Lisa reminded Dorian of the whiskey debt that he still owed the Missouri Fur Company. Not only that, but he threatened to arrest Dorian and carry him away as payment of the outstanding liability. Like many other alcoholics, Pierre Dorian must have been a bit of a problem when he was drunk. He may have been a bit of a problem when sober as well, but that's a whole other story. If he was a problem when drunk, he was all the more so when he was reminded of his whiskey debt. A quarrel developed between the men, gradually becoming more violent. Dorian left Lisa's boat and went directly to Hunt's tent to report what was going on. Lisa soon followed, using the excuse of borrowing a tow line. Dorian and Lisa continued to argue, and having had enough of the affair, Dorian struck Lisa, who then scurried to his boat for a weapon. Dorian picked up 2 of Hunt's pistols and prepared for whatever might come. Soon, Lisa appeared with a knife. What's that old saying, never bring a knife to a gunfight? Well, now things started to pick up even more steam because other men were carried into the argument. A member of Lisa's party, Henry Breckenridge, was at his side, while Crooks and McClellan were eager to avenge their earlier slight at the slightest indication of bad faith on the part of Lisa. It's really a miracle that they avoided bloodshed of some type, but W.P. Hunt was able to rein things in and get control. Just as the tempers began to cool, Lisa insulted Hunt himself. Now Hunt was ready to fight, and he challenged Lisa to a pistol duel on the spot. Now remember, at the time we're talking about here, the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr had taken place only 7 years earlier. Andrew Jackson's duel with Charles Dickinson has only happened about 5 years prior. Dueling was an acceptable, although entirely foolhardy, way to settle disagreements. Fortunately for everybody involved, calmer heads prevailed, and Hunt and Lisa dropped the idea of a duel. Instead, each simply went his own way, and all personal discussion between them stopped. The parties of Hunt and Lisa moved upstream towards the Arikara village, Hunt's boat slightly in the lead, just to be sure that Lisa couldn't arrive first and create some sort of disturbance for them. Again, the banks of the river seemed idyllic, being crowded with buffalo, elk, and antelope. The parties had their pick of game, and they ate well on this section of the river. The Hunt expedition will have reason to remember the abundance of game here very fondly, because in the months to come, things are going to become much more difficult for them. On June 10th, 1811, 3 Indians in a canoe paddled downstream to meet the boats. They were from the Arikara village, which was located in the area of today's Mobridge, South Dakota, at the mouth of Grand River. They had been informed of the approaching boats by the war party, which had arrived just a few days earlier. They had paddled downstream to meet them. It's likely that they also wanted some gifts prior to the boats reaching the village, but that's just my own supposition. These men also brought some news that gave Hunt a chill. When the large war party had surrounded his boat back at the sandbar, some Mandan and Minotari members of the party had encouraged simply killing the white men on board and taking all the goods from them. Only through the goodwill of the Arikara, who made up the majority of the war party, was that situation resolved peacefully. The two parties camped a few miles below the Arikara village on June 11th, each suspicious of the motivations and action of the other. Henry Breckenridge came to Hunt's camp to negotiate the arrival of the two parties in the village. The ceremonial entering of the village and meeting the chiefs was important to the tribe, and it was critical that they discuss how things would be done. Though still distrustful of Lisa, Hunt and his party were assured by Breckenridge that Lisa would not try to interfere with Hunt's business in the village, and for his part, McClellan said he would shoot Lisa if he perceived any treachery. There we go again. That night, the rain fell in buckets and it drenched everybody and everything. Since the weather had made sleeping difficult, the parties moved out very early the next morning. At about mid-morning, they met a canoe coming downriver with Left-Handed and Big Man, two leading men in the tribe. Through their interpreter, they communicated a message that Hunt had heard several times during his voyage. The Arikara would not allow the boats to go any farther upriver unless one full boat was left to trade with the tribe. Hunt quickly summed up his intentions, letting the men know that he intended to trade with the tribe, acquire horses, and abandon the river to embark on the overland portion of his trip. And this seemed to pacify the men, who turned their boat around and headed upstream with the boats of Hunt and Lisa. The Arikara village was just over 1,400 miles from the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. The village was split in half with about 80 yards between the two halves. Each of the halves was occupied by a distinct band of Arikaras. These two halves and two bands will become important during an episode that's going to occur 12 years in the future. And the village covered about 3/4 of a mile along the river. Left Hand called the meeting to order, yelling across the half-mile wide river, and being heard as well as if he had a megaphone. It's said that being natural orators much of their lives, many Indians had extremely powerful voices. And it showed here, but how would Lisa and Hunt enter the village? They still had to figure that out. They had not spoken since their disagreement, and although members of their parties had negotiated entering the village simultaneously, nothing had really been worked out yet. At about 2 p.m., both Hunt and Lisa boarded their boats and crossed the river. Hunt was accompanied by Mackenzie and McClellan, while Lisa was accompanied by two men who aren't really named in the sources that I've seen. They landed on the far bank at the same time, and they were escorted to the council lodge. Let's take a moment to look at the description of the council lodge. The council lodge was a central and most important part of the Arikara village. It was large, starting with 4 forked tree trunks placed upright so that the forks could support cross beams. These beams then held a frame of poles with willows interwoven to create a thick matting. Dirt was then thrown over the willow matting to create an insulating and mostly watertight outer layer. In the center of the lodge was a recessed area in which the fire was built, and the smoke ascended and escaped through a hole in the center of the ceiling of the lodge, which also allowed some light to enter. Recessed sleeping areas were spaced around the walls of the lodge, each one covered with dressed skins to form a privacy screen. The far end of the lodge was decorated sort of like the ultimate man cave. 2 painted buffalo heads decorated the wall, as did shields, bows, quivers, arrows, and other assorted weapons. The whole was arranged to create an impression, which I'm sure it did. The men all took their place at mats placed around the fire, and an old man appeared bearing the ceremonial pipe we discussed in episode 5. After everyone had smoked, Left-Handed signaled the old man, who then moved to the entrance of the lodge, and like the town crier of old, he received information from the chief and announced it to the village through the doorway. 20 additional warriors entered the lodge and took their places as their names were called. The pipe was passed, and each person took his required puff. The meeting would now commence in earnest. The chief delivered his monologue, welcoming the white men and letting them know that the tribe was happy to have them visit. He then changed his tone and explained how poor his people were. Now, this is a common negotiating ploy, and it's practiced by everybody, everywhere. You set the stage by telling trade partners that you don't have much to offer, establish low expectations. But it seems that few are as adept at pointing out their own poverty just before asking for some gift to relieve some of their suffering as the Indians from the Plains tribes. It had become an art for them, and every group of every tribe of which I've read expected some sort of gift. Some of this may have been left over from early tribal customs. Just as visitors were welcomed into the village and met with warm hospitality, those visitors were expected to bring some sort of gift for the occasion. It's also likely that asking for gifts from the white men was learned behavior after the early traders brought gifts to help build rapport and establish relationships. After the chief's opening speech, Lisa stood and expressed the friendship of the two groups toward the tribe, while also outlining his intention to continue upriver to trade. He then made it clear that Hunt's group had no such intention, but instead wanted to trade for horses and head west overland. Nevertheless, the two groups were bound together in common defense. Any problem with one group would be perceived as aimed at both groups. Friendship and the good treatment of both groups were required without question. He closed by asking that the tribe do everything in their power to assist Hunt and his party on their way. Now, Hunt's party was surprised, and Irving says a little disappointed that their rival, the object of so much vitriol, had been so gracious in both attitude and speech. After all, it's easier to continue to loathe someone when they continue to be loathsome in their behavior. Hunt spoke and confirmed his expedition's mission, outlining the journey westward. The search for the great body of salt water west of the mountains and his need to acquire horses for the journey were discussed. He had the goods needed to trade for these mounts, and he was ready to conduct business. Both Lisa and Hunt also handed out gifts of tobacco when the speechifying was ended. Left-Handed playing his role of sharp negotiator, doubted that his tribe had enough horses to meet Hunt's needs. They might not be able to spare any. And that's just smart negotiation. If you want to raise prices, especially something the other party has admitted they need desperately, base your negotiations on scarcity. We don't have many, and we want a lot for the ones we do have. But somehow this negotiating technique was not practiced by another chief, Gray Eyes, who spoke up and said that they had plenty of horses in the village, and even if they didn't, they could always steal more. Problem solved. Well, at least part of the problem was solved. Left-Handed called a moratorium on trades for a couple of days, enough time to get together with the council to fix the appropriate trade prices. In today's world, we would call that collusion or price fixing or at least price controls, but this allowed the council to oversee prices and be certain that individual members of the tribe weren't taken advantage of. Once this group decided the value of the various items in the village, the rest of the tribe had to abide by the rules, and no individual negotiations of price was allowed. Hunt then moved a distance downriver from the village and set up camp near Manuel Lisa. Guards were posted outside the camp to keep watch, and Hunt waited. When trade was allowed, Manuel Lisa set up his trade goods in Left-Handed's lodge, while Hunt set up in Big Man's. Horses were brought out, displayed, and tested. Once the trade had been consummated, the tail of the horse was cropped short to distinguish it from the horses belonging to the tribe. As I discussed in earlier episodes, the Plains tribes established wealth based upon the number of horses a warrior owned. This was a fairly recent development because the horse is not native to the Americas, being brought from Spain when the conquistadors entered Central and South America. These Spanish horses had Andalusian and Arab blood. They were fleet of foot and nimble and produced a small, hardy breed of feral horses we call Mustangs. North American tribes began acquiring horses in the late 1600s, but it wasn't until the mid to late 1700s when horses became widespread over the prairies. Certainly, the Arikara had not been familiar with horses until no more than 2 or 3 generations ago, yet they had become central and essential to the status of warriors and welfare of the tribe. These animals changed the way of life for every tribe, but none more so than those who migrated to the plains in search of the wandering buffalo herds. Some of the best horsemen and breeders were the most successful tribes as well. The Sioux, who had lived in Minnesota for some time, pushed westward into the Dakotas and Wyoming. The Comanche pushed north and east, and the Blackfeet pushed south and east. The Crow were also recognized as some of the best horsemen on the prairie. Smaller, less adept tribes were pushed out, and they suffered at the hands of better mounted and often better armed enemies who thrived because of European trade connections in the area. Here's another IOU. I'll do a future episode of the podcast on the horse and the impact it had on the various tribes, but that's coming sometime down the road. Because the Arikara were contemplating sending a war party out in pursuit of the Sioux, trade was vigorous, and the things they wanted most were guns, tomahawks, knives, gunpowder, ball, and other items needed to make war. Their cost and the demand for them was high. A base price of $10 worth of guns, whatever that means, per horse was established by the council, and with the market established, young men left the village on horse-stealing forays. They already knew the market was there. They're going to go get some more horses to trade. It's important here to think of something that is foreign to the mindset of the modern man. Seated as we are in front of our TV or computer, in a home defended by the local police force and the military, well, we are a world away from what the Plains Indians were. On the plains, stealing was as natural as breathing. It was looked upon as a skill worth honoring, and many tribes had superb reputations based upon their ability to steal a horse while it was being watched. The Crow were so good at stealing horses, and rightfully proud of this reputation, that I've read tales of horses being stolen from an owner who held the lead rope of his horse while he was sleeping. Now that takes nerve. While the negotiations for horses were underway, the men of Hunt's expedition were free much of the time. They walked around the village and they were welcomed into lodges to be fed and entertained. As mentioned earlier, a visit to a lodge meant that you would be fed without question. The women of the lodge worked hard to maintain the lifestyle. They set up and maintained the lodge. They gathered wood, sometimes having to travel miles to find and harvest firewood, which was then brought back downriver in a bull boat. They cooked, dried meat, dressed hides, and cultivated the few crops the tribe grew. None of this was the work of the warrior. The warrior hunted, provided game for the family and the village, protected the village from the threat of marauders, and waged war on the enemies of the tribe. When in the village, the warriors played rough games as a form of training for the vigorous work they would be doing. Gambling and storytelling were common activities as well. Women wouldn't allow their men to do any menial work, seeing that as a mark of disgrace on themselves as the caretakers of the family and the village. As the days passed, rumors spread that the Sioux had followed the white men upriver to the Arikara village. Now, to me, this seems interesting because the Arikara village was stationary. The location was clear. It had been that way for quite some time, so the Sioux didn't really need anybody to lead them there. But the rumors put everybody on their toes. Sentinels were placed on the hills outside camp because, although the prairie seems flat, those undulating hills can hide thousands of mounted warriors. Should one of the sentinels see either danger or the opportunity to hunt some buffalo, the signal to camp was to gallop back and forth on the hill. Now, they galloped in lines abreast to indicate game, and they galloped in a pattern that crisscrossed each other to indicate danger. That was the communication strategy employed by the Arikara. Now, any perceived threat to the village was met with immediate mobilization. Warriors grabbed horses and quickly rode away. Women, children, and the old men in the village, they all played the role of cheerleaders. They encouraged the men to take violence to the dreaded enemy who would dare to invade the domain of the tribe. And most of the time, these mobilizations were just false alarms, but I suppose each was a form of drill to make sure that everybody in the village was ready to do their part. While the rumors of the Sioux raged, the white men in the village didn't want to range too far afield to hunt, and because of that, meat became scarce. In reading tale after tale from the plains and western mountains, one of the most stable food sources for the Indians and early mountain men, including Lewis and Clark, was dog. Dogs were plentiful in native villages. They filled several roles. Each family had a number of dogs. In fact, I've seen the number of 2 or 3 dozen floated about. And that seems like a lot, but it's possible. Some of the best of these dogs were hunting dogs. Others were beasts of burden, pulling travois and sleds, packing materials around, that type of thing. And if you'll remember, in the days prior to the horse, the only beast of burden available to the North American tribes was the dog. Many, if not most of the dogs, were kept around simply as a ready food supply. While the white men were encamped near the Arikara village, several different parties, both war and hunting, came back into camp. They created a sense of excitement as the braves were brought to the council lodge to recap their experiences. The news spread around camp quickly, and one of the parties, which had been stealing horses from the Snakes, had done exceptionally well. The old men, women, and children crowded around as the triumphant warriors rode into camp, thrilled with the work they had done and the adulation of their people. But there were also the sounds of grief, as the women who had lost men on these missions went into the hills to grieve in their own fashion. The Arikara camp was a scene of constant action, something noted by the men in the expedition. One day, a delegation from the Cheyenne Nation came to have talks with the Arikara leaders. As the men smoked the pipe and discussed official business, the purpose of the visit was clear. The Cheyenne tribe would be coming to visit the village in about 15 days, so the official notice of the visit was being delivered now. Hunt was thrilled with the prospect of another tribe coming to camp. Because the Arikara refused to sell their best horses, he didn't yet have enough to set off across the prairie. And this would be an excellent way for him to get more horses because the Cheyenne were well respected as having good horses. And, of course, if you have competing sellers, the buyer's market always gets a little bit better. Additional horses were going to probably be bought at lower prices than he had been paying. It was at this point that Hunt's boats clearly became useless to him, and Lisa, knowing this, approached him with an offer to buy the boats and any merchandise which didn't need to be carried along for survival and trade. The purchase price would be paid in horses, which Hunt would pick up at the Missouri Fur Company post at the Mandan villages 150 miles upriver. As soon as the deal was completed, Lisa and Crooks took several men and headed upriver for the Mandan villages. 2 weeks later, they returned with the horses, but Hunt still didn't have enough. He needed more time and more horses. On July 9th, an Arikara war party of 300 braves returned to the village just before dawn. They brought news of their battle with the Sioux war party that had been troubling Hunt for quite some time. The Arikara had been successful, killing several Sioux and dealing them a sound defeat at the cost of 2 men and several wounded. As was custom, the war party waited atop the hills near the village until the village sent out the appropriate clothing and gear so that the men could dress in the fashion worthy of entering the village to the hero's welcome they clearly deserved. And since the warriors sometimes painted their entire bodies, and because they were so particular about their look, The wait for them to enter the village was quite long. In fact, it took until almost noon before they came into the village. So the dress of the triumphant warriors is an interesting thing to examine. While the Arikara normally wore very little clothing, the ceremonial dress was pretty ostentatious. They wore long coats and dressed antelope skin leggings with porcupine quill decorations. A buffalo robe might be hung over one shoulder, a quiver of arrows over the other. They could have worn plumed feathers on their heads, and any warrior who had killed an enemy in that enemy's land could wear a foxtail attached to each moccasin so that the tail would drag behind him as he walked. Anyone who had killed a grizzly bear wore a claw necklace, a token that, because of the difficulty of the task itself, was admired by anybody who saw it. The celebration of these returning warriors is, I think, worthy of reading verbatim from the summary that was supplied by Washington Irving. According to him, here's what we might have seen had we been in the village on July 9th, 1811. The pageant had really something chivalrous in its arrangement. The Arikara are divided into several bands, each bearing the name of some animal or bird, as the buffalo, the bear, the dog, the pheasant. The present party consisted of 4 of those bands, one of which was the dog, the most esteemed on war, being composed of young men under 30 and noted for their prowess. It's engaged in the most desperate occasions. The bands marched in separate bodies under their several leaders, and the warriors on foot came first in platoons of 10 or 12 abreast, then the horsemen. Each band bore an ensign, a spear or bow decorated with beads, porcupine quills, and painted feathers. Each bore its trophies of scalps elevated on poles, their long black locks streaming in the wind. Each was accompanied by its rude music and minstrelsy. In this way, the procession extended nearly a quarter of a mile. The warriors were variously armed. Some had guns, others with bows and arrows and war clubs. All had shields of buffalo hide, a kind of defense generally used by the Indians of the open prairies, who have not the covert of trees and forests to protect them. They were painted in the most savage style. Some had the stamp of a red hand across their mouths, a sign that they had drunk the lifeblood of a foe. And again, that's from the book Astoria by Washington Irving. The old men and the women of the tribe celebrated the triumphant warriors as you might expect that they would, and the slow procession continued toward and through the village. One wounded warrior was carried between 2 of the leaders of the war party. Badly wounded, the young man could barely sit his horse and had to be helped during the parade. He was met by his weeping mother, who had heard of his grievous wound and came to hold him. He rode through the village, holding his head high and proudly playing the part of a returning hero, and he died shortly after arriving back at the village. Hunt still contended with members of the expedition who were having second thoughts. This was a dangerous journey, and it's only reasonable to be concerned about our own welfare. In light of the things that transpired later, these men were not nearly as concerned as they should have been, but those are other stories, and we'll get to them later. The distance they would have to travel, although unknown to them at the time, was about 1,500 miles, depending upon their route. Much of the route they were going to take was unknown to them, and it was even unknown to Robinson, Hoback, and Resner, the guides who had joined them on the Missouri River, because they had only been as far as the Snake River in eastern Idaho, around the area where Henry's Fort had been located. Now, almost all the route west of the Rocky Mountains would be uncharted territory for everybody. There were miles of open prairie and worse, with barren stretches of land on both sides of the mountains. Lisa's men added to the discomfort by pointing out each of the bad things that might happen and exaggerating the dangers, although really, exaggeration was not at all necessary. These men would face hunger, thirst, cold, war parties of Sioux and Blackfeet, raging river crossings, grizzly bears. You get the picture. The dangers, both real and artificially amplified, were enough to convince some of the Canadian voyageurs to desert and head back to good old St. Louis. And after stealing weapons and a keg of gunpowder, they buried them in the riverbank, planning to steal a boat at some point and head back to civilization. John Day overheard the plan and informed Hunt and the other partners, who somehow put an end to the desertions very quietly. It was at this point that a man named Edward Rose entered the picture. Rose had lived among the Crow and was well versed in their culture and language. He was hired as a hunter, a guide, and he would be a valuable interpreter when the expedition entered Crow country. In all the resources I've read, Ed Rose has been described in some unflattering terms. Rose, who came from Kentucky, was the son of a French-Canadian father and a mother who was of Cherokee and African ancestry. He's described as having a powerful frame and a look that was somewhat dark in nature. Being of mixed-race ancestry, that likely played a significant part in this, but Rose had a colorful history of all of his own. He had worked on the Mississippi as a young man. Some people say that he was a pirate on the Mississippi. Some that he was a pirate in New Orleans, and other stories say that he had to leave the river entirely because of a fight in which he killed someone. Given his nature, that could be a very true account as well. Regardless of how or why Rose came west, everybody seems to admit that he was a fully capable man. He was a furious and effective fighter. He was almost fearless to a fault. In fact, his nickname among the Crow was Five Scalps because of a fight in which he took 5 enemy scalps by himself. So he was a good hunter, a good trapper, and a good guide. He lived with the Crow tribe for years at a time, and he played the intermediary between the Crow and many parties of whites who engaged him to lead them through the territory. Much of Rose's reputation comes from the books written by Washington Irving, who refers to Rose in both Astoria and Captain Bonneville. I've become a big fan of a book written by a fellow named Don Barry. It's called A Majority of Scoundrels. And this book takes what I think is a very realistic look at the fur industry in the 1830s. Barry believed that Irving had himself taken a dislike to Ed Rose, the character, and therefore painted him in a particularly negative light. Barry points out that Chittenden, who wrote another book I highly recommend, The American Fur Trade of the Far West, had an entirely different opinion of Rose. According to Chittenden, if judgment were to be passed only on the record as it has come down to us, he would stand as high as any character in the history of the fur trade. And Barry agreed. He said that there was no contemporary account that he had ever seen that mentioned any wrongdoing on Rose's part. So if you think about that, it's kind of interesting how reputations can be manipulated based on one or a few sources. Everything finally was in place to move west, and Hunt and his party left the Arikara village on July 18th, 1811. Lisa was left behind, expecting Andrew Henry to arrive from his Fort Henry post at any moment. The scientists also left Hunt's expedition. Bradbury and Breckinridge returned to St. Louis, and not all stayed at the village with Lisa. Although he had decided to move west, Hunt still didn't have the complement of horses that he needed to make the journey. The 82 horses in the expedition were mostly pack horses loaded down with trade goods, traps, ammunition, cornmeal, and the other essentials of a party traveling overland. Each partner rode a horse, and Pierre Dorian had a horse to transport his small household's baggage and 2 small children. His pregnant wife, however, walked, as did the rest of the men of the expedition. When Hunt and his men left the village, Manuel Lisa believed that they would never reach the Pacific. Hunger was a very real danger in the unexplored wilderness, as was the threat of Indian attack by the many tribes along their path. To the men who saw them walk away from the Arikara village, Hunt and his men seemed to be doomed. The expedition traveled northwest, but that was really not in their favor because they were headed directly into the teeth of the Blackfoot tribe. And discretion being the better part of valor, they decided to turn southwest to put some distance between themselves and that country. They crossed several of the tributaries of the Missouri and crossed the seemingly endless prairies in western South Dakota. The wind blows incessantly on those plains, helping to provide a little relief from the heat. And because there's less moisture and less vegetation, there are typically less insects, so that is one small blessing of taking that route. Here the men experienced the western skies for the first time, and if you've never been out on the plains with a clear blue sky, you really can't understand the feeling that you're going to get when you are in the big sky country. Now I know it's not Montana, but the skies on the prairies are very much big, whether you are in Montana or Wyoming or Nebraska or South Dakota. And if you've never been, you should make plans to take a trip. To make travel, cooking, and camping easier, the men were divided into small messes in a military style. Cooking utensils were split up to make the process easier for everybody. Some men slept in tents, others under the open skies. The Canadian voyageurs who, because of the abandonment of the boats, had been put out of a job, they proved to be capable and willing packers and camp helpers. They loaded and unloaded the horses, pitched the tents, built the fires, and tended to whatever needed to be done in camp. The hunters tended to their jobs and scouted away from the line of travel, hunting enough game to keep the party supplied with meat. The first few days of travel were slow. Several of the men were sick, including Crooks, who was so sick he couldn't ride his horse and had to be ridden on a litter. They camped on Grand River on July 23rd and stayed several days. Buffalo were plentiful, and they needed that time to lay in a supply of dried meat and allow the sick people to recover as well. While they were in this camp, John Day, Ben Jones, and some other hunters stumbled upon an Indian camp on a small stream. The lodges were set up, and large horse herds were grazing on the nearby plains. Now, these men thought that this must be the Cheyenne camp, and it proved to be that, and the hunters were welcomed in and fed. Now, I think earlier I referred to maybe talking about what the Indian style of hospitality was all about. I don't think I did refer to it earlier, though. I said that I had already talked about it, but I hadn't. I just remembered reading about it. But the way that the tribes, perhaps many different tribes, but certainly the Plains tribes dealt with hospitality was talked about by Osborne Russell. Osborne Russell was a trapper who traveled west with Nathaniel Wyeth in 1834. He later wrote a book called The Journal of a Trapper, and he had kept notes, and he talked about what he did during his time in the mountains in the 1830s. But Russell talked about the customs of the Indians when it came to feeding guests. Most of the tribes welcomed you to their lodge, and they brought large portions of food. It was considered an insult to turn down the food or to fail to consume the food, all of the food, on the spot, or at least take the leftovers with you. So when you came to camp, they wanted to feed you, and it was your duty to eat, and to eat well. So the hunters ate, and they returned to their camp, and several of the Cheyenne went back with them. With the expedition still needing mounts for the trip west, the Cheyenne wanted to trade horses, and the expedition had goods to trade. So it was a great opportunity for Hunt and the Cheyenne to engage in some trading. For 2 weeks, the expedition camped on the Grand River, trading with the Cheyenne. The dress of the Cheyenne, which had consisted of the typical Cheyenne dress, leggings, moccasins, buffalo robes, that type of thing, gradually began to change because more of them started wearing bright cloth, brass rings, beads, vermilion paint on their faces. All of those had been acquired during this trading expedition. As much attention as the warriors paid to themselves, they were more concerned about the appearance of their horses. They wove feathers in their manes and tails, hung pendants around their necks, and generally decked them out in finery to match their masters. The Cheyenne tribe, much like the Sioux, have moved west because of the introduction of the gun and later the horse. Living in the Great Lakes region of Minnesota, the Sioux, which was a much larger and more formidable tribe, started pushing them west in the 17th century. During the drive westward, over time, they became nomadic hunters, following the buffalo and using horses to travel, all of which was a consistent pattern for many of the Plains tribes. On August 6th, the expedition left the Cheyenne camp and headed west. They'd been fortunate because they had been able to acquire 36 additional horses through their trade with the Cheyenne, and now their baggage could be distributed across more horses more evenly. Each of the 6 hunters now rode a horse of their own, and the voyagers now had a horse for every 2 of them, so they could switch off walking and riding. Even with the additional rest, though, Crooks still couldn't ride, and he had to be carried on his litter. And on they traveled. Hunt was more at ease now. The expedition was no longer in Sioux territory, and he was getting far enough away from civilization that desertion didn't really have the same appeal that it had once held. As always, when one problem is resolved, though, another seems to rear its ugly head, and now it began to appear that his interpreter and guide, Ed Rose, was plotting, along with some of the men of the party, to steal horses and trade goods, taking them to the Crow tribe themselves. The appeal for this is really undeniable when you think about it. These men were traveling west into a situation that was extremely high risk, definitely an uncertainty as to what was going to happen. And they were doing it for workers' wages. They were getting paid daily wages, monthly wages, yearly wages, as it were. It was hard work, and anybody who was a rational person would have reason to second guess his decision during the long hours of travel and work. when there's nothing to do except walk and think, you can think up a lot of things that perhaps wouldn't be on your mind during other times. Rose promised that life among the Crows would result in good treatment by the tribe, but beautiful women, and the horses and goods they could steal would place them among the wealthiest of the tribe for life. Washington Irving gives a good description of the Crow tribe. The Crow occupied a stretch of land which is now in south-central Montana, and the area is northeast of the Bighorn Mountains. The current Crow Reservation is located in the heart of that country. The men of the Crow tribe, as we've noted with the Arikara, and was the custom with all the Plains tribes, well, they were out hunting or raiding as a matter of course. This was the way of life and the way of survival for the Indians. It was the way to be wealthy. It was the way to demonstrate that you had become a man. The Crow men were noted for their exceptional skill as thieves, as I've already mentioned. They made their reputation by stealing and by going out on the warpath. The Crow traveled across the Rocky Mountains, stealing and trading horses, which were then driven east to trade with the Plains tribes, who had the guns, the ammunition, and the other trade goods that had been picked up from white traders in their areas. It's easy to see why the lifestyle of the Crows would appeal to the men in the party. It's easy to see how Ed Rose might have been scheming to rob Hunt's party of horses and trade goods, and it's easy to see that Hunt had a problem on his hands. If the men were so unstable that they seriously considered deserting to the Crow tribe, well, he was sitting on a powder keg that could be set off with any event. After discussing this, Hunt and his partners decided that nothing really could be done at the moment, but watch closely and do whatever they could to minimize the risks of desertion, and on they traveled. As Hunt's party traversed the plains, they found no wood to fuel their fires. The Plains tribes had long used buffalo dung as their fuel, and these men adopted the practice. Living was relatively easy because of the presence of the enormous herds of buffalo, and that's why the native tribes were on the plains anyway. They had taken what was a more hand-to-mouth existence in the eastern parts of the country along the rivers and the lakes, and they went to a lifestyle which required them to travel a lot, but also provided an enormous amount of food with relative ease, so it's easy to see why they were there. With the pressure sort of reduced when it came to securing the daily meals, there was a lot more time for the hunters to explore, which is something that they did every day. One day, Pierre Dorian, Carson, and another hunter named Guardpie, I think that's not spelled correctly, but that's the spelling that I got, didn't return from the daily hunt, and in fact they hadn't even returned by the next morning. Now, it was a normal occurrence for the hunters to follow tracks until they found their game, and so the party assumed that this was the case with these three men. A signal fire was left burning to help lead them to the old camp, and the expedition moved on. When the men hadn't returned by that night, however, another signal fire was lit on a hill. 2 additional days went by, and the party slowed their pace, giving the men time to catch up. Finally, they started to fear the worst, and Hunt started to think that the men might be lost for good. It was on August 10th, after finding firewood near their daily camp, a huge signal fire was built. It was not uncommon for men to become lost, taking days to regain their sense of direction and catch up with their companions. The plains could be very confusing, and if you were out on the plains, one direction with no real landmarks looked pretty much like the next direction, so you had to be very careful with that. As the expedition moved through rough country, though, there were rocky hills, deep ravines, and nearby meadows. All those provided plenty of buffalo for harvest, and knowing that the size of the expedition meant that he could not hide from the Indians in the area, Hunt continued to worry about the safety of the interpreter and hunters that had been lost. Now, all this time, the threat of Ed Rose's desertion hung over Hunt's head. Finally, he decided to let Rose know of his intention to leave Rose with the first party of Crows that the expedition encountered. He wanted to unburden himself from the threat of Rose deserting and taking men and horses and goods with him. To help sort of allay the temptation to steal from the group, Hunt also told Rose that when they parted, he would pay half a year's wages for the services that Rose had performed. He would give him a horse, 3 beaver traps, and some other trade goods that would allow him to be a man of means in the Crow village. Now Rose would be almost as well off in this situation as he would have been if he had stolen and deserted, and the risk was much lower. So at least it appeared that the problem was solved. On August 13th, the party headed due west, Hunt still hoping to encounter his hunters on the right fork of Grand River. They reached and crossed the Little Missouri, camping on the northwest bank where the grass was still excellent and buffalo still plentiful. It was while camped here that the three lost men finally made their way back into camp. And as Hunt had feared, the men had lost their way because of the number of herds of buffalo and the trampled grass in all directions. They'd ridden back and forth across the prairies, never really seeing any of the smoke from the signal fires, until they finally crossed the trail of the expedition, which they followed to camp. Everybody in the party gathered around to celebrate their return, and on they traveled. The men were now struggling to cross eastern Montana and northeastern Wyoming. As they made their way through the hills, they encountered bighorn sheep and found that it was an excellent source of mutton. It was during this time that they got their first look at the snow-capped Bighorn Mountains, which were about 100 miles to the west. And it was also at this time that the numerous berry thickets in the area caused a great deal of concern among the voyagers. Thickets in that place, at that time, meant grizzly bears, and these men were not thrilled to have camped in the virtual center of a grizzly bear's kitchen. To really understand their concern, we need to thoroughly understand the grizzly bear as it existed in 1811. It's really not much different today, though. The grizzly bear was a mighty foe in the minds of the tribes of Central and Western North America. When Lewis and Clark were traveling across, they were warned to leave the grizzly bears alone. The Indians knew that these bears were large, powerful, and they were hard to kill. They could run faster than a horse in short bursts, and their sense of smell was incredible, 7 times stronger than that of a bloodhound, and hundreds of times better than a human's. Now, one of the things that offset this was they had terrible eyesight. So, in one way, you were okay. They couldn't see you, but that also meant they could smell you from miles away. Now, they could and would smell you when you were in the brush. And if they decided to attack, which was just as likely as not in the days of single-shot muzzle-loading rifles, you might measure your life expectancy in seconds. If you were lucky enough to get a shot at an angry bear, you'd best hope that that shot killed him. A wounded bear was an angry bear, and an angry bear was a deadly enemy. Some of the biggest grizzlies had claws up to 5 inches in length, and you'll remember that the grizzly bear claw necklace that the Arikara wore was an honored token of the hunter's ability, proving that killing one was not a walk in the park for anybody. Those voyagers who feared the grizzly bear in the thickets, they had reason to be on edge. One morning, William Cannon, a former soldier who had been with Hunt since Mackinac, went out hunting. Now, he was a poor hunter and a poor shot, so Cannon was he was the butt of a lot of different jokes. He was given a hard time, and he was excited when he actually killed the buffalo. He was quite a ways from camp, and he really couldn't dress and carry all the meat back, so he took some of the best cuts and he wrapped them up in a package. He carried the meat Canadian Voyager style, resting over the shoulders on the back with a strap around the forehead to support the weight. I've looked at this method of carrying something, but never tried it. Seems difficult to me, but it must work pretty well. And in fact, the other day my wife and I were watching a video, and I noticed that the Sherpa in Nepal carry loads in the same manner. So maybe we'll all need to give that a try sometime. And if you'll give it a try, let me know what you think about that. See how it works for you. Cannon was headed back to camp with his pack of meat resting on his shoulders and upper back. Happy with his success, we can imagine his state of mind as he was navigating his way through the hills and the brush in the area. But at some point, he heard a sound behind him. Now, I can't imagine what that would have been like, but I do think it would be extremely hard to look behind you when you have a strap around your head and a weight on your shoulders. But Cannon did. He must have wished he hadn't, because what he saw when he looked was enough to make anybody panic. Attracted by the scent of the meat, Mr. Grizzly was in hot pursuit. Subscribing to the old adage that one who sees a grizzly and runs away lives to see a grizzly another day, Cannon dropped his pack of meat and did the one thing that we are told never, ever to do when we encounter a grizzly bear. He ran. Now, the grizzly bear is an apex predator. It has a strong prey drive, and just like your house cat, that chases a toy mouse or a ball or a string across the floor, the movement of a runner triggers a response in the bear to chase whatever is moving. Bears have notoriously bad eyesight, but the sense of smell drives them forward. So the motion triggers them. They don't really know maybe precisely what they're seeing, but they do see the motion, they see the action to run away. And the bear saw Cannon running, didn't even slow down for the buffalo meat. Instead, Cannon had to discard his rifle and climb a tree just ahead of the bear. The bear set up camp at the base of the tree while Cannon waited. Darkness came, and Cannon couldn't really tell if the bear was still waiting at the bottom of the tree, so he decided that a night spent in the tree was better than a grizzly attack. The next morning, Cannon looked around to find the bear. He was gone. Climbing down from the tree, he didn't even pick up the buffalo meat, but instead went straight back to camp, glad to have survived another day. Hunter John Day also had at least one experience with a bear that we know of during the trip west. Day and a young clerk were out deer hunting when they saw a huge grizzly emerge from a thicket about 150 feet ahead. Now, 150 feet is nothing like enough distance between yourself and a grizzly bear. At 40 miles per hour, a charging grizzly can cover 150 feet in about 3 seconds. So you'd hardly have time to see the bear before he was on you. Luckily, Day's bear wasn't charging, but was instead standing on his hind legs, growling and trying to scare the men away. The clerk aimed his rifle at the bear, but Day, being the experienced hunter he was, placed his hand on the young man's arm and said, "Be quiet, boy. Be quiet." The two stood still and watched the bear, which stood still and watched them. Finally, he turned and started away. But he hadn't gone far when he turned and came back to resume his threatening posture. Day again told the young man to be quiet and stand still. Finally, the bear turned and walked away, stopping a few times to turn and growl at the men. As he moved far enough away to provide a safety margin, Day is said to have exclaimed, "By Jove, I can stand this no longer." And he shot the bear, wounding him but not killing him. Luckily, the bear was hurt and not angry, and disappeared into the thicket. The clerk asked Day why he chose to shoot the animal when he did. "Why, boy," said Day, "caution is caution, but one must not put up with too much, even from a bear. Would you have me suffer myself bullied all day by a varmint?" As the expedition headed west, they moved closer to the Bighorn Mountains in the distance. Although it was only August, the chill in the air was noteworthy, with thick frost on the ground in the mornings. Winter was going to be rough. On August 22nd, they crossed the trail of a large band of Indians. Ed Rose and some of the hunters thought this was the trail of a party of Crow, making their way back from a trading trip to the Mandan villages. Much like game trails and rough country, the Crow's trail offered the path of least resistance, and Hunt's expedition followed it. The country was rough, and the weather had turned so dry that they traveled one 25-mile stretch with no water, and one of Mackenzie's dogs died from thirst. While they finally found water, they were keenly aware that they had traveled days with no real grass for their animals. Since there wasn't grass, there was really also no buffalo, so there was no food for the men. And because the meat was becoming scarce, the only thing that they had was one wolf, some cornmeal, and that was their supper. The next morning they moved on to one of the forks of the Powder River, which had grass and plentiful buffalo grazing on the meadows. Hugging this stream for a few days, they took advantage of the grass and the buffalo, killing several and drying the meat for future use. Even as they hunted, traveled slow, and rested a bit, the trail of different Indians, thought to be Crows, was found in the area. Because the Crows were so good at stealing horses, the party knew they had to exercise extreme care to protect the animals that they had. On August 30th, the party camped at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains. The Rocky Mountains present themselves as many different mountain ranges, running sometimes in different directions, and therefore crossing the mountains really was not a simple task. Mountain passes were choked with snow even in midsummer, and a guide with the knowledge of the best path was invaluable. To give you an example, a quick personal experience example to illustrate the length and severity of winters in the Bighorn Mountains, in June 2019, I took what I called the trip of a lifetime to a conference in West Yellowstone, Montana. Being me, I chose to drive. I love long road trips, and this was an excellent chance for me to do just that. So I made my way from my home in northeast Tennessee to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I mean, I had to go see the Harley-Davidson Museum after all. And then I drove on across Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, into and across the Black Hills. I stopped at Devil's Tower, which I can't recommend highly enough. I drove through Wyoming to Garryowen, Montana, the site of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or the Greasy Grass, and finally back down to Ranchester, Wyoming, so that I could make my way into the Bighorn Mountains. Now, my intention at that time was to stop at the Medicine Wheel on Medicine Mountain in the Bighorns, and I did. If you haven't heard of the Medicine Wheel, look into it. It's a fascinating piece of history. Prehistoric Indians built the Medicine Wheel. It's sort of a Native American Stonehenge, I guess you might say. There are many other medicine wheels in different places scattered across the mountains, but this is the only one that I've seen. And I did stop, and I did try to go see the Medicine Wheel, but I couldn't. When I parked in the parking area, it was cold, but you could park there, and there was nothing there to be concerned about. But as I looked up the mountain farther, as you had to walk up the mountain to the Medicine Wheel, there was snow still on the ground on the trail. And as I started to walk up there, what I found was that the snow was still hip deep before I could get to the top of the mountain. So I was probably half a mile away, at least a quarter of a mile away from the top of the mountain, mid-June, and the snow up there was still hip deep to me. My wife and I returned in July of 2022, and we were able to see the Medicine Wheel up close and personal. But it was mid-July, and it was a cold, windy day. We were really glad we had our winter coats while we were standing on top of the mountain looking at the ancient stone wheel. Finding and crossing those high mountain passes with Hunt's party during this time was going to be difficult. While at the Bighorn camp, the expedition was met by two Indians who were well armed and wild looking. Ed Rose rode out to parley with them and found that they were members of the Crow Party, which had been leaving signs in the area. The two men visited with the whites until late in the night. They returned to their village that night, but early the next day, several of the tribe returned and invited Hunt to come visit their village. The expedition soon struck camp and moved toward the Crow village, which was 16 miles away. The Crow chief came out and greeted Hunt, pointing out where the men might pitch their tents. As the party got the camp in order, Hunt presented gifts of a scarlet blanket, powder, ball, knives, trinkets of various types, and tobacco to distribute to the warriors. All the while, Hunt and his men worked with caution. The reputation of the Crow preceded them. The next day, trading commenced in earnest. Because the Crows had so many horses, trades of worn-out horses that the party had used up were made, and they were pretty common. Some of the men who didn't have a horse at all purchased their own, and the party's number of horses increased to 121 in total. But now there arose another problem. When the men in the expedition had traded for all that they needed, they stopped trading. But that was a very unwelcome turn of events for the Crows. The warriors started to become upset. They became menacing and disrespectful. Some thought Ed Rose was the cause of this, and maybe he was. For his part, McClellan, who was consistent in his method of dealing with the problem, threatened to shoot Ed Rose on the spot if any violence broke out. The tense moments passed without bloodshed. The next morning, Hunt decided that it was time to move on, and he said goodbye to the chief and to Ed Rose as previously planned. Hunt headed south, skirting the mountains while looking for a practical way to cross them. The eastern slopes and foothills of the Bighorns are beautiful. Today, Sheridan, Wyoming and Buffalo, Wyoming are a couple of the towns resting in the shadow of the Bighorns. Grass and game were plentiful, and all seemed to go well that day. Later that evening, however, it became clear that leaving the Crows behind was easier said than done when several warriors from another band higher in the mountains visited the camp. It was clear that the only path to safety was constant vigilance against the threat of theft and possibly worse. On September 3rd, Hunt decided to try to find a pass across the mountains. Now, you and I both know that you can't miracle a mountain pass into existence just because you're impatient with the pace of travel, but Hunt tried to do just that. After scrambling around the rough and dangerous terrain, some of the men wandered away looking for water. As we would expect, there was no pass here, and Hunt returned to his camp at the base of the mountains. But the men who had wandered away looking for water did not return. The next morning, Ed Rose showed up at their camp with some Crow warriors. He brought a message from the chief who wanted them to know they had taken the wrong road and that Rose would guide them to a nearer and better pass across the mountains. Well, why not? You're lost, no real way of knowing how to cross this barrier, wondering who to trust, and you have to trust somebody. I wonder though, why didn't Hunt discuss this with Rose before leaving the Crow tribe? I mean, Rose had been with Hunt and his party since back on the Missouri River. So why didn't Rose offer some advice on how to cross the mountains through the most expedient way? That's an interesting question. And why now does Rose have to come save the party? I don't know. Just one of those things I kind of wonder. At any rate, soon they encountered the whole Crow band heading in the same direction. So Hunt's party fell in with the tribe and rode with them on the journey. The men couldn't help but notice the exceptional horsemanship of the Crow. Every member of the tribe rode, men, women, and children. And Hunt noted that a little boy 2 years old, who couldn't even talk yet, was tied on a colt, holding the reins and using his whip just like he'd watched the adults do. Because Hunt's horses were heavily loaded, the Crows gradually pulled away from them. And perhaps Hunt also held back a bit to try to put some distance between himself and the warriors in the Crow tribe. When the tribe went out of sight, Hunt set up camp at a little mountain stream and stayed there for an additional day to allow the tribe to move on and his men who had gone looking for water to catch up, which they soon did. The next day, the expedition continued to move west through the mountains. The Bighorns are a beautiful and rugged range, and these men were finding the difficulties of crossing them. As they moved along, they noticed a small group of Indians watching them from the rocks. A few rode horses, roughly outfitted with crude bridles or halters. And as it turns out, these Indians were a mixture of Shoshone, also called snakes, and flatheads. Now here there should be a little clarification. There are at least two groups of Flathead Indians. One lives on the Columbia River and gets their name from flattening the heads of their infants by tying a board across their heads. The other lives in the mountains in Montana, in and around what is now Missoula. And this is the group Hunt and his men were dealing with. And these Flatheads, and for that matter most of the other tribes in the area, were mortal enemies of the dreaded Blackfeet. The Shoshones or snakes lived on the upper forks of the Missouri as well. You might recall that Sacagawea's tribe, which was Shoshone, lived in the area of Beaverhead Rock when Lewis and Clark traveled through there in 1805. But they were driven out of that country by a Blackfoot tribe which had been equipped with guns through trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. Having been pushed deep into the mountains by the Blackfeet, the standard of living for the Shoshone had suffered. The tribe had essentially split into two subgroups. One still possessed horses and could still descend onto the plains to hunt buffalo. They were simply called Shoshone. The other subgroup usually did not possess horses and were at such a disadvantage that they had now been reduced to digging for roots in the mountains and living on small game and deer in the higher elevations. They were often called diggers. The Flatheads and Shoshone had formed an alliance against their mutual enemies, the Blackfeet. Anytime either tribe went buffalo hunting on the plains, they were in constant fear of attack by this ruthless, destructive enemy. One account tells of as many as 500 armed warriors sitting atop a hill while a small group of about 50 were hunting buffalo on the prairies below. They had to hunt and harvest their meat quickly and then move back into the mountains as soon as possible. Hunt's men rode along with these Indians, and they made their camp near each other that night. The combined groups dropped down out of the Bighorn Mountains into the Bighorn Basin in modern-day Wyoming. Buffalo were plentiful in the basin, and the white men and Indians combined for a successful buffalo hunt. On September 9th, the expedition and the Indians parted ways. After traveling about 30 miles, Hunt and his men came to the North Fork of the Bighorn River, called the Wind River, because of the wind that blows along the river in the winter. To the west lay the Wind River mountain range as well. These mountains have proven to be the birthplace of the rivers that flow to the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of California, and the Pacific Ocean. The parting of the waters national landmark is here, the place we envision when we think of a continental divide where water flows both east and west in Atlantic and Pacific creeks. The Bighorn Basin is a desolate landscape in general, with few trees other than along the rivers. The men camped on September 14th at the forks of the Bighorn River. It was here that Robinson, Hoback, and Resner had told Hunt that he could reach the Columbia River, really the Snake, by crossing one range of mountains. They were close to the point where the water would flow their way. Rather than take the direct route across a single pass, Hunt and his guides decided to head south, looking for a stream that would take them around the southern end of the Wind River Range. What Hunt didn't know, nor did anyone else in the group at the time, was that they were looking for South Pass. This much easier route across the mountains was yet to be recognized by white men. Later in the day, as they topped a hill and looked west, they caught the first glimpse of the Grand Tetons, 3 mountain peaks serving as a beacon for travelers in the area. Hunt called them the Pilot Knobs, and it was here, according to the guides, that Hunt would find a source for a fork of the Columbia River, the river that would take him and his men to the Pacific coast. It was the Snake River, but I think, if I remember correctly, I'll remember this for the next episode and make sure I get it right, but I think they called it the Mad River because it was so energetic and was flowing so quickly. At any rate, traveling on south and west, the men reached the Green River Valley and found plentiful buffalo and berries on the bushes in the mountains. Now later, this area would be the site of many of the rendezvous that were held by the mountain men in the 1830s. But for now, it's just going to be the Green River Valley. They were able to hunt buffalo, jerk the meat for transport, rest a bit before crossing the mountain pass. The men knew that they were close to the Tetons, but no one understood that even after reaching the Tetons, the men still had hundreds of miles to travel across a brutal and barren country. As I read about their upcoming journey and thought about their excitement during the time they camped here in the Green River Valley, I once again thought about the concept of foreseeing the future. I think that we would often choose a different path if we knew in advance the difficulties we're going to encounter by choosing a particular thing. In this case, it was best they didn't know what was to come because there would be a great deal of suffering before they reached Astoria. Sadly, it's time for me to wrap up this episode of the Blood and Leather podcast. With Hunt's expedition just about to camp at the foot of the Grand Tetons, it's a kind of a natural stopping place. Their journey across the mountains and through the rugged Idaho and Oregon wilderness is epic, and it's brutal, and I'll need ample time to cover it all in episode 7. As always, researching and writing this episode has been a total labor of love for me. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope that my enthusiasm for the history I've covered shows. The legacy these people left simply can't be overemphasized, and their work led us to become who we are and where we are today. We should be proud of them and their legacy that they bequeathed to us. Before I forget it, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to support a wonderful free internet resource, the Internet Archive. It's a nonprofit which can be accessed at archive.org and houses a wealth of information in all kinds of forms. I've enjoyed finding and reading many different books about the fur trade and the men who risked so much to venture into the wilderness. I have many more to read and can't wait to dig in and share the stories I uncover, and none of this would be remotely possible without archive.org. So please head over and make a small donation to their cause. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, please like, share, subscribe, follow, leave a review, send up a prayer, any and everything else required for the platform on which you're listening. I do have a Patreon page which you can subscribe to for a small donation each month at patreon.com/bloodandleather. Your support means more to me than you know, and I can always be reached at bloodandleather@gmail.com should you have any questions or comments. I mentioned Patreon, and I'm working on coming up with some things to add value. I'm trying to put additional content there, maybe some maps, some additional research material, and maybe a few videos from time to time with some supporting documentation. So give me some time. I'm going to be working on that. Again, thanks for listening to Blood and Leather. I'm Tim Carter. Endeavor to persevere.